Osiris.
Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Spotlight On, presented by Osiris Media. I'm your host, Lawrence Peryer. Today, the spotlight shines on the wildly influential post-punk group That Petrol Emotion. Guitarist and songwriter Raymond Gorman and lead singer Steve Mack join me to mark the release of the band's career-spanning box set, Every Beginning Has a Future, and Anthology, 1984 to 1994. Spawned from the ashes of the Northern Irish pop-punk group the Undertones, the Petrols synthesized all of the music, culture, and politics around them to create something vibrant and new. Across 5 albums, all given a fresh cleanup and augmented with singles, B-sides, and rarities in the new box, the band combined 80s indie alt-rock, post-punk, garage, dance, and even hip-hop to innovate their way into becoming one of the most important and influential bands of their era. Their genre hopping and political identities came at a cost. While their fan base was fervent and ever-growing, mainstream success eluded the band. Their sound was too difficult to pigeonhole, and their politics, particularly their identification with Northern Ireland and other liberation struggles around the world, made them untouchable and in some cases censored by the mainstream press of the time. But the music and the legacy is undeniable. That Petrol Emotion fits neatly on a record shelf alongside trailblazers like The Clash or Public Image Limited. And you'd be hard-pressed to imagine a Britpop or Manchester scene without the path they forged. I could have spent another hour or two with Steve and Raymond, and hope to one day. In the meantime, we have this conversation and, of course, the music. Enjoy. I don't want to do like a linear take me through every step of the way discussion with you guys. I think you've done that. And I think the essay in the box set does a really good job of recapping the story. And I'd rather just probe some other things with you. So I hope that's okay.
Yes, great. Whatever you want.
But it's funny that you use the word nervous, because that's not a word I would ever think of in relation to your band. You guys always exuded a lot of confidence. It's a funny word to hear you use in relation to the Petrols or in relation to your work. Manic, for sure. Manic is the best word. Like, you guys nailed it the first time out. That is the best word. But I don't think of you as having been nervous. Were you nervous?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, live TV was nervous. It only happened a few times, but say, for example, whenever we just put out Chemi Crazy, and like I think we wanted to actually do Abandon live. It's this program called The Late Show on BBC. It's kind of like an arts program. It's really good. And I thought we should have done Abandon because everybody would have been loose. It would have been fantastic. But our manager insisted that we do Sensitized. And the thing about it was that was a song that came together in the studio, and we hadn't really played it live. I mean, once we played it, 10 times live, it was great. But to do that live, and it was all backing vocals, and you're really a little bit unsure. That's what I mean by nervous. Do you know what I mean? When you're not sort of totally in command. Whereas, like, the first time that we were on British TV, was a program called The Tube, and it's one of the best things we've ever done. It's just fantastic. People still talk about it to this day. It's one of the kind of defining pieces of footage of the band, and it is live in front of the studio audience as well. There's no chance to muck up.
I would say that we were always a very passionate band, and that right before we would go on, I mean, Raymond and I were losing our minds. And to this day, I'm still playing, and I still get nervous every single time before I hit the stage because you care, right?
Yeah.
You want to go up there and I want to give those people the feeling that Iggy Pop gave me when I saw him, right? That Jello Biafra gave me when I saw them. I want to be afraid. I want to be enthralled. I want to be taken to a place that I haven't been to before. And that's what we always strove, was to give them everything. And we did. I mean, like, if you ever came backstage to see us afterwards, we were awful because there was nothing left. I mean, we were just exhausted.
Like lying on the floor. Yeah. Like everybody lying on the floor.
Towels over their heads.
That's why we used to wear these hideous shorts for a while. And it's like, it looks bad now, looking back. But at the time, we used to, like, you lose half a stone in sweat on stage because it was intense. I remember a guy said to me one time, even your sound checks are intense. And it's true because we could never do that thing of being a bit laid back. And it's better now. Like the band we have at the minute now, the Everlasting, yeah, that's a lot more laid back. But even the first time that we played live in the Everlasting, yeah, because I was doing most of the singing, I almost had a conniption fit in the morning thinking about it. And I really worked myself up. And then literally I had to sit and do like deep breathing for about an hour and get myself centered. And then, of course, we walked on stage and nobody had seen us play for ages. So there was just this warmth and love from the crowd, who'd followed the Petrols. Now they're coming to see us. And it just lifted me up. And I thought, well, what am I worried about, John? Playing in front of people who like your music. It's not going to be a fight. They're going to be into what you're doing. Just bloody relax.
Yeah, you passed the audition.
Yeah. But I mean, think about, like, did you ever see a bad Gang of Four show? No, they were always transcendent, right? And that's who we held up as our heroes. We want to be good as the people we saw, right? And it demanded absolute dedication and focus, right? And so that's why we were always that way. And we always exploded on stage because we were trying to, right?
It's true. Even from the early days, I mean, it was always unspoken as well. There was just a belief that we were going to succeed. I mean, failure was just not an option. I mean, you had John O'Neill at the beginning, who's one of the most pessimistic people either, who tried to bet me that our second record wouldn't sell anything. It was his song. So you can imagine you're up against that. But still, like when we didn't have a deal or anything, we just always thought it's a matter of time. Look, we'll keep going. We're doing really well. We're doing all the right things. This is going to work.
When we came out at a really interesting time in the British music scene. There was a real lull going on. Like the most exciting thing you could see would be like, a goth band bathed in fog going, oh. And that was all fun and stuff. But we got up there and just started blowing people off stage, right? And when I started stage diving in pubs, people were like, what is going on, right? And we just came up with this 2-guitar and Kieran just beating the crap out of the drums and me jumping on people's heads. And we just threw people off guard. They expected Jimmy, and they got Flesh Print, first song, just bam, a haymaker right in the side of the head. It was just great because people were just like, finally, right? This is so great. This is what we've been waiting for.
It was funny, yeah. Definitely the scene was there was a real lack of energy. I remember thinking, jeepers, it was a real kind of hangover, sort of post-punk hangover, like that second wave of great post-punk bands we really like Gang of Four, Magazine, all these people, they're all long gone. And a lot of the guitar bands all had a lot of pedals as well, especially like kind of delay and chorus, which I really hated.
Thank you, Edge.
I think like one of the things we wanted to remind people, why punk had happened in the first place. And it's just more like a kind of attack of sort of like the way Dr. Feelgood seemed in 1975, when people were into Yes and Genesis and stuff. You get this. I remember hearing Dr. Feelgood for the first time. And at the time, I really liked bands like the Sensational Alex Harvey Band. And I even liked this band called Bebop Deluxe. And they had the most over-the-top production. What do you call that guy that did Queen?
Oh, Roy Thomas Baker.
Yeah, Roy Thomas Baker. So he did the Bebop Deluxe record. And if you look, and then the first side of this record called Futurama, it is fantastic. I still love it. And obviously it's one of my teenage records as well. But I mean, if you hear Dr. Feelgood in comparison to that, it's stripped down. There's no fills in the drums. There's no guitar solos. It's just like attack, it's like Wilco giving it the attack. And I think we had something of that. Just back to basics again, but just good, short, sharp songs. Do you remember, Steve, we had to tell people, you'd come on stage, everybody be sitting around the floor. I remember being like, get up. But the first...
Those polite British audiences.
Well, I'm just getting back to the kind of hippie time again, where people would sit on the floor and you'd listen to your... I'm trying to remember what kind of bands were around that time.
Yeah, it was a weird time. It's sort of post-New Romantics even. Like it was a weird... Steve used the word lull, and it is. When I was going back to some of the early, even press material about the band and the early V2 and that era, it was a weird time. It was this weird void. It was like there was Duran Duran. They sucked all the air out of like the mainstream pop, and then the
the street level stuff, it seemed like there was just this real confusion around what was rock music going to be next.
It was only really in rock music, I was saying, because, you know, like I would have been listening to a lot of like early hip hop and electro and stuff that I still really like. So a lot of guitar bands were not on my radar anymore. I think there was only, like, I remember John, he really liked Dream Syndicate. You know, I had that, like, we really liked that single, Tell Me When It's Over. And John says that inspired him to write Keen. So, you know, that was one of the few kind of guitar records. But always have been American bands as well. I don't think there was any real British bands that I was that keen on anymore. A lot of my favorites are all broken up, like Buzzcocks had broken up, Magazine had broken up, Joy Division were now New Order. I say New Order were one of the few sort of bands that I loved at that time. They were able to transition really well.
They really were. It was funny, you know, going back and reading a bunch of old stuff. There's a Robert Christgau quote. He was reviewing Manic Pop Thrill, and by the way, he gave it an A-, which is good.
That's
still room for improvement. A-, you know, you can still, but he called you guys a professional Irish garage band, and I love the word professional. Like it's like they're highly capable.
Well, I think there's something in that, you know, because I remember when I was actually in the band with John and Damien. And I was always impressed by their work rate, you know, because I had tried for years to get the people to be in a band, and it was always the same. You know, we'd be in the pub and be like, yeah, we're going to start the band. We're going to be like this. We're going to be like the New York Dolls. We're going to do this. Right. We'll meet tomorrow and we'll play, and then nobody will turn up. You know what I mean? That happened to me so many times. So when I met like John and Damien, I thought, you know, I'd seen the Undertones. You think, well, that's professional already. Do you know what I mean? Okay, it is. I think that's pretty good. The Undertones were a professional garage band as well, garage rock, because they really thought about doing a show and doing the set list and stuff. So we learned all these things very, very quickly from them. I mean, the band I was in before, the Petrols band in McClellan, I joined them and they were already been going for a while, but I was a little bit older and stuff, and I kind of got them into a bit better shape because they were just lacking a bit of discipline. And then subsequently, when I left, then they became like a different kind of thing. Because when I was in the band, we had two drummers, basically. We had a guy that did like floor toms and stuff. So it was kind of like Adam the Ants meets Echo and the Bunnymen. And it was great. And it's a shame that there's no record at that time except for like a really bad audio cassette. Always with John and Damien, there was always that professionalism there. I don't know where they got that from, but they have a really good work ethic as well, which is why I think they succeeded out of Derry, because Derry's very much, if you can imagine, it's like a tiny island within a small island. And people in Derry, usually they don't care what's going on even 2 miles down the road. And there's people in bands there who are quite happy to just be well known in Derry, and that's the height of their ambition, you know?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's okay if that's what you want, you know?
There's been so many interesting like one-liners about this band. Like as I was reading, like I said, a bunch of other contemporary interviews and even things that you all have said in the press over the years, it's amazing some of the pull quotes. So throughout our conversation, I might read a couple of these to you to get your reaction. It's just amazing how insightful, especially journalists were at that time, about how they were really trying to figure you guys out in terms of your sound and where you were coming from. But one of the things that you said, Raymond, that I love is that you were like the Undertones after discovering drugs, literature, and politics, with a lot more girls in the audience dancing. And I had the same reaction initially. I laughed at that quote. I was like, that's so poetic, but
That's true. That's why you didn't get so many. Like Undertones fans are more kind of anarchy, I think, you know.
And I think that's what's like belied by that quote is what happened in that period of time as the O'Neills were transitioning to the Petrols, and for you all, did you grow up? Like, were you expanding your horizons? You talk about literature, maybe experimenting with drugs. Like that's a real thing. Like what were the ingredients that made you guys a more mature band other than just a garage rock band? Because there's certainly so much more substance.
Yeah. So when we started, Damien was actually in London. He wasn't there at the beginning. So it was John, O'Neill, and myself. The Undertones had broken up. At the time, I couldn't really appreciate it, but I can appreciate it now. He was feeling pretty down. and he wasn't feeling very inspired and stuff. But we got together, just like a fan's love of music. Basically, we would start meeting up, and then we'd just play records all the time and talk about records and books and films, and be drinking, of course. It was a kind of social thing, and there was a kind of crowd in Derry because I'd just come back from university. So I'd finished university and there was no jobs at that time. So I was like, what am I going to do now? And so we started doing this kind of club night, John and myself and this other friend, Mickey Rooney. And we basically pulled our record collections. We started playing, and it was a real kind of broad church. It was like usually you go out on a Friday night in Derry, and at that time it would have been like top 40. And the DJ would be talking on the mic in this kind of fake American accent, and that's kind of what it was like. And then we turned up and we didn't talk at all. We didn't have a mic for talking. We just played the music, and we would play everything. We'd obviously played more sort of obtuse stuff and more out there stuff in the early times. But, it was to get everybody out dancing and to get a vibe going. And very quickly, we got a whole scene going. I mean, you're talking about maybe 100 people at most. It wasn't a big thing. But, those people were so passionate about that club, and nobody missed it, and if you heard a record, if we played a record, everybody would go out and get it. And it was just brilliant because it brought everybody together. And, because a lot of people were stuck in certain categories, they don't move out of like indie pop or whatever. They don't know anything about black music. So we're playing everything, and we get criticized for it as well, because certain people are very conservative there and they didn't want to know. So John starts getting excited again. So he gets me on board to start writing songs again. But as well as music, we're talking about books all the time as well. And books became a big thing in the Petrols. Everybody in the band would read, especially when we were on tour, and books would get passed around and we'd have discussions and arguments or whatever about different books.
We had a tour library on the bus, right? And we would each bring like 4 or 5 books and swap them around. And so I'm bringing all my Gore Vidal, American history, and then we're going through the canon, right? And we're just Kurt Vonnegut, John Dos Passos,
White Noise, Don DeLillo. I can't remember. John Irving.
John Irving
is a big favorite around that time, actually. Really good. Up until Owen Meany, he was fantastic. Yeah, so we were passionate about those things. I mean, 3 of us in the band were university educated as well. I mean, John and Damien, they're self-taught. Like Damien was, I think sometimes, I've told Damien this as well, he would sometimes feel like, because he hadn't been to university, he would feel a bit sort of, I haven't been to university. But, they're both very smart guys in their own way, and just look at their lyrics. I mean, Damien's always slagging off his lyrics, but he writes good lyrics when he puts his mind to it. It's just, I think he finds it quite a chore.
Let's not forget that the Undertones, before they became the Undertones, right? They had been basically a family band. There are more O'Neill brothers, right? And the only reason Damien was allowed to join originally is because he saved his money and he was the only one who had an amplifier. So even though he was the youngest brother, he got put in and one of the brothers got kicked out. Anyhow, so you can imagine that band had certain limitations because they were together for so long, right? And it was a very sort of limited input of new ideas, right? And it was John's band, essentially. So along comes Raymond, university educated with a lot of ideas, Kieran, university educated, a lot of ideas, me educated with a lot of dumb American ideas, really strong egos, and all of a sudden, there's like this tension and this push and pull between 5 separate members. And John took this to heart and he just got inspired, right? He's like, wow, okay, so now I've got this guitar player who's challenging me and he's playing all this different kind of stuff. He's got Kieran who's beating the crap out of the drums back there, Damien who's trying to be a lead guitarist on bass, and me who's jumping into the audience. John just sort of went, wow, this is brand new. I need to write songs that are going to suit this band, and I can, whereas before, the Undertones, they had their shtick, right? They're one of the greatest punk bands ever, but an Undertones song when you hear it, right? It has an Undertones formula, right?
The Undertones are a bit limited in their way, like the Ramones were. They couldn't move. They weren't allowed to move out of a certain parameters, Plus, the Undertones have this horrible attitude that I really don't like. And it's not really to do with John and Damien, it's the rest of them. It's this thing in Derry where you can't you can't be seen to be pretentious in any way. Do you know what I mean? You can't seem to have ideas above your station. Do you know what I mean? You're supposed to sort of, like, if you ever read Mickey Bradley's book, it'll just make you want to punch your head. Do you know what I mean? It's all.
Oh, really? I haven't read that.
Yeah, there's just too much humility and too much we're not worthy. Do you know what I mean? It's like, for God's sake, stop it, you know?
People aren't paying good money to see you just be normal, right? You're supposed to put on a show. It's supposed to be bigger than life.
No, but I think he's even very scared of, like, calling what they do art. And I'm saying, well, what is it then? Of course it's art. It's like, you know, it's when somebody comes up with a song that didn't exist beforehand, you know, even if it's a bad song, it's still something that somebody has produced and they've created something, you know. Is that not art? Do you know what I mean? I stand there. They used to drive me crazy. I mean, there's stories about the Undertones. Oh my God.
Ah, well.
Here's one. No, I'll say one. I'm only going to say one. Robert Fripp. They were playing in New York. They played in New York. Well, it must have been the time when they were playing the Clash. And Robert Fripp came backstage to say hello. And they said, "I'm sorry, Robert, we can't talk to you. We don't like your music." That's what they said to the guy who came back to tell them, to hang out with them, to tell them they were great. And I just thought, oh, I had my head in my hands. I'm like,
no wonder he's so cantankerous. They did it to him. Before that, he was a pleasant man.
Well, those were different times. And like the first year of the Petrols, there were quote unquote rules about what could and could not be done and who we would listen to in the van and what was acceptable and not. I mean, at one point, I just had to lose my temper and tell John, if you don't want somebody who's going to jump out and challenge the audience, then you've got the wrong guy. Right? Because he was saying, you're detracting from the songs. These songs are serious. You need to stand still. And I'm like, fuck off. No.
He was always on the loser, that one, definitely.
Well, that's an interesting point, though, the idea that there were rules, because you would never guess that in the music, right? Like, it's the most, I mean, non-rule based, formulaic.
We got rid of those rules pretty quickly. I mean,
that's what happens when you got 5 really strong egos.
This is a hangover from the Undertones stage, you know, that sort of Stalinist punk. You know, the Undertones really, they believed all that shit. And later all the punks came out, like Keith Levine was a roadie for Yes. Do you know what I mean? Everybody didn't.
I love that.
You know what I mean? It's like everybody, like a lot of, like, say that I was just a little bit too young for prog rock, but like Kieran, for example, who's 2 years younger than me, knows all of it, because he always had knocked about with older people, you know? And it's like, well, look, some of that's okay. Some of that music's pretty good, you know. But I mean, it reached the stage, I think, obviously 74, 75, where it became preposterous, you know, where like ELP had their carpet roadie, you know, and they've got like 3 10-ton Lars.
You guys weren't wearing like white robes or anything?
Yeah.
No kimonos on stage?
We had our share of bad sartorial choices over the years.
I think that's the one thing. If you got a bit of success, who knows what would happen, really. The fact that we were never really that famous, it kind of saved us in a way, I think, from those kind of extreme reactions.
Do you have any memory or strong impression? Where was the band the biggest? Like, do you remember where the audience had the most sort of passionate reaction? And did you distinguish that way, or was it like, it didn't matter where you were? I'm always curious about how artists perceive where they are and whether they notice changes in the audience.
There are several points in our career where, for me personally, I realized that things were changing, right? That we were graduating to the next level. I remember in particular playing the Metro in Chicago. So many of my favorite bands came from there. Walking out on that stage and seeing Chicago just go nuts for us, it was just like I went weak at the knees. And then later on, after the show, REM came backstage to talk with us. And Peter Buck said, "Hey, we're playing Babel every night before we go on." And I was just like, my head was exploding, right? We had all loved REM since their first record, right?
Yeah.
The EP. And now here we are sitting talking to these guys. That was incredible. Playing New York at the New Music Seminar at what used to be the Ritz, and the place is just packed and going nuts. I mean, like, we were always popular in urban centers, right? So any big urban center that had a rich college radio format, we'd be huge there. And it was just always so gratifying because many of these were cities. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a year when I was in college. Going there and playing the 930 Club was just like a coronation for me. I felt so great playing there and seeing some of the DC scenesters that I recognized in the audience going, I can't believe they're here to see my band. This is the greatest thing ever, right? We also had a big following in France. We had a big following in Holland. Basically, anybody that we put the work in, anywhere that we toured, we would have a significant following at a club level there. So it was just fabulous every time we'd hit one of those big towns, playing the Milky Way in Amsterdam, right? Playing the Pigalle in Paris. These are just classic moments that I'll never forget.
Yeah, I would get the sense that if you barnstormed through a town, you were going to leave believers in your wake.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's funny Steve mentioned that Chicago gig. There's very few, obviously, I can remember vividly that we done, but I think I have a real strong memory of that one. Because I remember we were just on fire and we walked on and there was a great response already. So you respond to that and you just get more. And then, as Steve said, REM's there. And then we went to see them. They invited us to see them the next night. So, and they played Babel over the PA before they went on. They had started to do, auditoriums, maybe, 15,000. They had kind of gone up because I had loved the first two REM records in particular. And when I came to London, they were the first band I saw in London. Then, they would take them years before they came to Ireland. They were never going to come to Derry, that's for sure. So to see them was a real affirmation of, so it's funny, what we were saying earlier about there was nothing really around at that time, like REM were the band, 84, 85, 86, 87. So to get their validation, it was tremendous, and then it was, as Steve will tell you, you're rubbing shoulders with all the people who you loved growing up. I had Pete Shelley's telephone number. We played with Iggy Pop. We met Iggy Pop. He was so nice. He's the complete opposite of what you thought. Met Arthur Lee and supported him with the band that I had after the Petrols. Met Television and Tom Verlaine was a dick. So I've met nearly all of the people that I love. So it's incredible.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On, presented by Osiris Media after this break. And now, back to Spotlight On.
One of the other quotes was that the New York Times said that you guys were like a youthful Rolling Stones crossed with a revved up television. And again, it's the kind of quote, you read it, you could pass right by it. But if you stop and think about it for a minute, it's like, yeah, that's actually pretty fucking good. That guy earned his check for copywriting that day. I wanted to ask a couple of other music related questions before I think we'd be remiss if we don't have a politics discussion or we'd be missing a big part of the Petrols canon if we don't do that. But first of all, we're talking on the occasion of this new anthology, this box set that's come out. One of the lines that's in all of the copy about it is that it says it was done in cooperation with the band. And I wonder what that means in practice. Like going through the packaging, there's, first of all, the music itself, there's so much that was collected, right? Assembled, we could do an hour or two just on some of the remixes that are on there. It's phenomenal. I think that's where you really get some of the diversity in the music, right? You get a lot of the house and the hip hop influence, especially as you get a little later on. There's a lot of cool photographs and ephemera in the booklet. Who's sort of the band historian and who was what were your contributions to the actual release?
Basically, Damien and I kind of got everything together for the booklet. Obviously, we worked with this guy called Tony Lyon, who he put everything together. He did all the artwork and stuff. So we worked in tandem with him. And as it turns out, he knew Damien's wife. He was at college with her. They knew each other very well. So it made things very easy from the beginning. So he lives down on the coast, but he'd come up to London 2-3 times and we would go through stuff. So it was stuff that, Damien's a good archivist. Damien, I think all the best photographs on the booklet are all Damien's personal photographs.
Mm.
I'm the audio archivist, so I'm the one who had to dig up all of these rare things that we didn't even have digital versions of. So I'm having to digitize off of 7 inches and things.
Steve's always been sort of technical expert in audio, getting the audio as good as possible. And as he says, checking things down. It was a kind of labor of love. I mean, it took a while. It didn't come together so quickly. And there were a lot of kind of really good happy accidents. For example, the guy who did the sleeve notes, John Harris. That came through Phil Wilson from the June Brides, his wife. She's a local councillor. And so obviously John Harris started off in music journalism, NME and Guardian, and then he does more political stuff now. We had no contact with him, but we knew from his Twitter, he had a picture of the Glasses photograph from Babel on his Twitter feed. Then Phil Wilson's wife started saying to me, "Oh, John, this big, huge Petrols fan and stuff. And you should ask him," because I put this thing out on Facebook. I was trying to get some way, instead of me or one of the band writing something about ourselves, I thought it'd be nice to get, a lot of quotes together from the fans. But they sent them in. Most of them were rubbish. It wasn't what I asked for. I was hoping for some Bon Mo and some, but not everybody can do that, obviously. So I approached Phil's wife. She put me in touch with John, and he just agreed to do it straight away. We were limited to about 2,000 words, I think. And he was like, brilliant. Like, some journalists really like that. They like being given how much they have to write. And I mean, I think he did such a great job, really. I couldn't have asked. I remember when I read what he'd written, I felt really emotional, because it's rare that you get something written that you think it really is just like hits the target like a bullseye,
What I think is really interesting also is, even though, as the Tap would say, our appeal got more selective over the years, the people who like the Petrols are so incredibly passionate about it. We did a series of listening parties over the pandemic, and people were there every time. We started an hour early, basically to make sure that I didn't screw up the Zoom call, but everybody was there. They're talking about what they're drinking. They're talking, "Oh my God, it's so good to talk to you again." These are people who don't even know each other. They're just talking over our Zoom call chat message. And their passion also, here's a journalist who does politics, but he's secretly a huge, passionate Petrols fan, right? And he's posting pictures of us from 30 years ago on his Twitter feed. And if you look in The Guardian, they're still to this day using headlines like blah, blah, manic pop thrill, blah. They incorporate our song titles and our album titles into political headlines and stuff. And I see those and I'm like, wow, we left a mark, however strange it was, but we are stuck in a lot of people's imaginations. And it's really gratifying, right? Like, we cared about it so much. And sometimes it's easy to think that not having the commercial success, that we didn't have success. But in some ways, I'm kind of more satisfied with this, in that we left a lasting mark among the people that we really care about. Even though it may not have been reflected in financial success, I still have a great feeling about the legacy we left behind.
You went there, and I was trying to think about the entry point to ask you about that, which is the one thing I never detect in any, I did a lot of reading around you guys and in conversations with you. There's no perceivable bitterness. There's this thread that's sort of attached to the Petrols of, like, it was always about almost. And a lot of the writing in retrospect is about how didn't get their due, ahead of their time. It's that thing of, like, you talked about the New York Dolls, same thing, like wildly influential. But there's a whole bunch of bands like that. Big Star would be one. These bands that their influence and their impact and their notoriety are bigger than their commercial success. Yet you don't key in on the downsides of being, like, almost having the thing. It's really amazing to hear you talk about the joy in the thing you did have, not the anger or bitterness about what you didn't have.
The miracle of time, right? If you had talked to us in the mid-90s, it would have been a different story, Lawrence.
Very fair.
There's an underlying bitterness there. Of course, there is a little bit, but as you say, as you get older, that has to recede, and you have to look at it in a different way. I said to somebody recently, I'd rather have been in the Petrols and have 10 years of what most people would consider a success without actual proper commercial success. We were going for 10 years. We made 5 studio records, 2 live records. I mean, I couldn't believe how many songs were on the box set, actually. I thought,
crazy.
Wow, we did all that. That is crazy amount of work, really. And both Steve and I would say we didn't work hard enough either. Do you know what I mean? So it's interesting. I'd rather have done 10 years like that than have 18 months with a worldwide hit. And then after 18 months, you're sitting in your house and it's all gone. And how do you cope with having that level of success? What would that do to a person? Do you know what I mean? So you have to think, well, it's worked out. We're all still alive. We're all still friends. You know, how many bands can you say that for? You know, when we get together, there's something like Kieran always says this, whenever we get together, there's an energy of the five of us, or even the four of us sometimes. When the five of us are together, it's the Petrols, and it's more exciting than your normal life. There's an intensity there, but there's a real joy there as well. So I think I have so many memories of being on stage and being so in the music that it's like being in the furnace of the moment. You don't get that from anything else, and you can't pay for it. You know what I mean? So you get that. That's what it's all about. As Steve said, you know, all we were trying to do at the beginning, we were trying to emulate your heroes. Nobody was sitting down going, "Oh yeah, well we've got to have another one in that territory, boys." You know, it's just not the way it works. You know, I mean, I remember when we had to go away and write hits, and I thought, well, if I sit down to write a hit, it's not going to come. Because, or else it'll be shit, you know, or it'll be very obvious or something. So you try and do something that's like one of my heroes who were famous, you know, and had top 10 hit, maybe that'll work. And, you know, that was the kind of closest I got to that. But the thing about it is, I think anybody who listens to our music, you might not get it straight away, but I think if you persevere with it, it'll be with you forever.
You know, I made a playlist of the singles. I came at the catalog a few different ways. So I wanted to experience it a few different ways to bring some different contexts to the experience. And so one of the ways I approached it was just listening to the singles. It's incredible how there's, you know, I don't know, it's called 8 to 12 singles, maybe more, maybe whatever, you know, generally around a dozen or so. When they're isolated away from the albums that way, it's like, oh my God, this greatest hits album is insane. But it's also like, it's just left to center. Like, oh, why wasn't this the most massive hit in the world? It's like, oh yeah, because it's like, it's a little noisy. It's a little edgy. It's a little dissonant. It's a little like whatever. And there's no negative connotation that I bring to any of those words. It's just, it's not played straight. And I think that's the thing that's to me is really sort of exciting and what brings more of the longevity to it, because it's not incredibly dated. There's some production stuff that you can mark as a sound of the 80s, but not terribly so. Certainly not stuff that's, you know, all back in vogue now that you hear in music. But last question about music before we pivot to the conversation about politics, which is what role did like noise play in your music and like the introduction of that element, of that sort of left of center element? Did you intentionally dirty up your sound? Did you say, you know what, this is too poppy, we need to make it less pretty? Or was it just the organic way you created? How intentional were you about the sound?
It's a little of both, really, because on the one hand, we were huge Per Ubu fans. I mean, at one point, I think we covered live every single song on the first Per Ubu record. We loved that record so much. And there's stuff, you know, you had Alan Ravenstein in the background just going nuts with these whop, whop, whop. We loved Roxy Music with Brian Eno doing these left of center things. And those are the things that you remember, right? Like in Remake, Remodel, like there's just all those little things that just were these, for us, hooks. We're like, we love that sound, right? And so we were always trying to figure out ways of bringing that element of surprise into our music. You know, it just so happened that John was capable of writing just these, churning out these pop singles. And we were like, well, how do we then take that and make it more interesting, right? And Raymond was always going to like swing it to the left with his guitar parts, right? Because John would come in with an arpeggio and Raymond would go, how about this? And then we're like, okay, now what else can we do? And that was part of the fun of jamming these songs together, was deliberately trying to deconstruct them and put them back together with slightly different pieces that took it to a more interesting place.
I think John and Damien, they'd already had, you know, commercial success with their singles as well, so they weren't so bothered about it. It's not fair to say that, of course, we tried, we always wanted to make the singles be heard on the radio, so we're never going to try and sort of jeopardize commercial success. like we would always talk about things being poppy, but that's our notion of poppy. We think Cloud 149's poppy. Do you know what I mean? That's the sort of thing. I mean, there's a few songs, a few of the singles, and I just don't understand why they weren't hits, because we did everything right. I think it was just to go towards the whole political thing. I think it was the politics that knocked us down. I mean, people just had an idea of what they thought we were, and we were never able to change that. And we should have shut our mouths sometimes. But what happened was you go to do an interview with some journalist, and of course we'd be in a pub and you'd have a few beers, and then a lot of times they weren't prepared. They would ask you the stupidest questions, or they'd be completely ignorant about everything. And so you get annoyed. Like if we had been a few years older, you would have been more calm and zen about it, and not kind of flew off the handle. I was so glad whenever we finally stopped talking about politics, because by that stage I was sick of it. And it was whenever we went to America, that was when we realized that we were kind of wasting our time a bit, because I think it was the first time we went to America. So that would have been 87, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. They were talking about NORAID and about how they were sending money to the IRA. And we were just appalled, just like, that's not what it's about. Like a lot of Irish Americans have a romantic ideal about what it's like, and it's just not helping anything. And even us talking about it is it's not helping it either, because a lot of people have preconceived notions. So all we should have done was, you should have put the things on the sleeve and say, look, that's our politics. What do I need? I don't need to tell you anything else. All we talk about is civil rights issues. We don't talk about Irish nationalism or anything. We don't talk about the IRA. But unfortunately, one of the singles was left with a tour manager to give in the information for the back of the sleeve. And we put this quote from this guy called Liam Fellows for a Genius Move single. And it was in Jerry Adams' book, but there was no need to put Jerry Adams' name there. But of course, he didn't know any better, and he put it in and he printed it. So then you're looking at the sleeve and it says Jerry Adams' name on it. And it's like, it doesn't even matter what it says. You just see, at that time, anybody from the nationalist community, if they came on TV, an actor would say their words for them. It was the most ridiculous thing. I mean, that was, I'd say 1988 was the worst. After 1988, things definitely got better. But in 1988, it was it was the worst year of my life. But I think in general, there was a horrible feeling even in London. There was became very conscious of kind of homophobia. One of my friends kind of came out, and seeing the reaction to that was pretty interesting up to a point. But there was just a horrible feeling. There was a kind of underlying feeling of violence there as well. And it was just kind of horrible.
These were dark times. I mean, you got to remember that Thatcher was smashing the miners' unions. The Troubles up in the north were just at their kind of peak. The public sentiment was terrible. Like, there was all of the stuff that the U.S. was doing in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Honduras. And so the climate in a very politically aware city like London was just hot. It was really, really hot. And when you've got 6 weekly or monthly music publications, they're all sort of competing for quotes. They were deliberately prodding us and trying to get us to say something, and they would take things out of context, put it out in a pull quote, and all of a sudden we're in the Sun as one of the top 10 worst bands in the world, which I still take pride in.
You were number 6. You were the 6th most hated band. I love that it was number 6. Like, it wasn't number 2 or 1 or 10. It was like number 6. And who were the other 5 motherfuckers that were worse than you?
The only time we made the top 10, right? We have to take some pride in that.
Perfect. It's such a Petrols thing to be the number 6 most hated band.
It was really funny because, like, literally the next year, the 89, if you remember, like, the Berlin Wall came down. Things really kind of loosened up, because I think it couldn't have gotten any worse, actually. It was just, and I mean, I kind of feel like that here at the minute. I think we're over the worst. Maybe you feel that in America, but there's still a threat. I'm not saying we're back on safe territory again, but I think things are not as bad as I thought they were going to be a few years ago. We've lived through these times already. We've seen how times can change quite quickly. I'm hoping that, and I'm being really optimistic about that, if we can get past this horrible kind of stage that we're at now. Well, everything's completely binary. Do you know what I mean? There's no middle ground. There's no consensus. There's no subtlety in what people say. Do you know? There's no nuance. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah. And by the way, that's where all the interesting things happen, right? That's where the more interesting art's created, the more interesting thought happens. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting also if you talk to, I hate to use this phrase, but if you talk to younger people, or if you talk to Americans in particular who have only visited London in, say, the last 20 years, in my memory, going to London in the 90s, it was almost grayscale or black and white. It started to really become Technicolor around like maybe the drum and bass scene or at the Blue Note, or like it started to become the London it is now. And I wasn't there in the early mid 80s. The transformation of London itself, like any of the big cities, but London in particular, it's so poignant to me how it's really hard to understand what it was like even 25 years ago, never mind 45 years ago.
I would actually argue the opposite, in that it was Technicolor and that it's gone gray now. And let me explain why. When I first got there, coming from Seattle, Washington, which was at that point a tiny little provincial city, and I got there and people were literally in tribes. There was the Rockabilly tribe, and they all had these amazing quiffs and perfectly washed Levi 501s. And they weren't like noon 501s. They were 501s from the 50s, right? Then there were the goths, and the goths had these beautiful long-haired women, and they danced and the rain came down. And then you'd go to a 60s club, and the 60s hippies were like everybody. Every night of the week, you could go to a different decade, dance your butt off, and it was just so amazing and colorful. And now you go there and everybody's dressed in a tracksuit, some $100 sneakers, and they're riding bicycles. And to me, that's sad. That's not London. That is any city in the world. And it used to be this place where you could cross-pollinate these scenes. And I remember when we first started getting goths and rockabilly showing up to our show, I was like, yes, we've done it, because we would play these different clubs. And we'd, like you said, we'd knock a few fans over, and they'd start coming to the other clubs, which previously they hadn't gone to. And then you'd start seeing all these different people coming. And it was just this great mixing melting pot back then. And it was so fun.
There's so many tourists here at the moment. It's unbelievable how many people are in central London. I mean, seriously, compared to the 80s and the 90s, even the early 2000s, it's ridiculous, because the pound is really weak now. So it's full of tourists. I mean, I was up there. I went to the cinema up the West End last weekend. I just could not believe how many people there were. It's just ridiculous. But definitely something has been lost in London. But I thought that when I went to New York in 2008 as well. It's like all the places we used to go that you really loved, your secondhand record shops or Bleecker Bob's or just all the kind of independent places. It's just all now.
East Village is gone.
Yeah, it's
right.
Just gone. Yeah, it was so sad. And London's the same. They not like all the venues near Tottenham Court Road. A lot of venues that we would have played, that you would have gone to, stayed with me to see bands and stuff. A lot of them are all gone. I mean, there's new ones coming up as well, and there still is quite a decent music scene. You just got to look up a bit harder now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still there. But I think you're right. Those tribes just don't really exist anymore. And I think, I don't know, that was kind of the end of youth culture for the way that I saw it, So it was like kind of went from like the 50s to the early 2000s, and that was it. Whereas we used to be, you would rebel, like probably our generation, we all rebelled in certain ways, whereas the kids now are all introverted. Everything's going in instead of going out. That's my theory.
I guess my only other question along those lines was the role of music in the culture and the intersection you all lived at of politics, music, and the different genres. I think something that's interesting about music now is I do feel like there's been more of an obliteration of genre since the mid-late 90s. I find that exciting about music. Like a guitar band can have a beat or it can have electronics in it. And I think of Beck as sort of a primordial version of that, right? Like he brought together the hippies and the skate kids and the hip hop kids and the folk kids. Like I appreciate that. But music's role in the greater culture does seem diminished, despite the fact that music is everywhere now. And I wonder, like, how do you think about that? Is it in your consciousness at all? Does it concern you?
I have to admit that I'm just an old man now, right? And so anything that I'm going to come out with is just sound like me waving my fist at the kids, right? Get off my lawn. But I do feel that something very, very important has been lost, in that music was something, it was one way that we had a shared experience, the way we experienced music and the way we went together to see a show. And you would feel like the world was a better place because we are all here and we are watching the Gang of Four, and this is the best night of all of our lives, and we can all talk about it for the next month, right?
But you'll shut up during the gig. You'll shut up during the gig. You won't talk through the gig like they do now. That's the difference.
Yeah, and you won't be like holding your camera up to prove you were there, right? It's like, put that shit away and just lose yourself in the music. I feel sorry that the kids don't seem to have that, but then I'll talk to one of my friends who has a 19-year-old daughter, and she will come home just high as can be off of seeing somebody whose name I don't know. And I'm like, oh, it's still there. It's still there. I'm just unaware of it because I'm too damn old. So I hope that they keep that, because it's so important to all of us to have something to share, something positive together.
Well, listen, I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate the music, and it's so great to talk to the two of you. Thank you so much for making time for this, and thanks for all the great music.
I can still talk more if you want. Famous last words.
Thank you so much, Raymond Gorman, Steve Mack, and all of that Petrol Emotion. As always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, which is presented by Osiris Media. Executive producers are Lawrence Peryer, RJB, Brian Brinkman, and Matt Dwyer. Producers are Lawrence Peryer and Michael Donaldson. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. If you like what you've heard, please share us with a friend and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Be sure to visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com or at spotlightonpod on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for listening. Be safe and stay in touch.
Osiris.